It is February 28th, 2021. Lesson 120. I rest in God. I rest in God today and let Him work in me and through me while I rest in Him in quiet and perfect certainty. 110. I am as God created me. I am God's son. Today I lay aside all sick illusions of myself and let my Father tell me who I really am. So it's really cool that, the month is ending and we're ending the review and then we're starting a new lesson tomorrow as we did with New Year's, my birthday, etc. So everything is in synchronicity. So I wanted to visit this idea of the present moment. Why? Because that's the only way that we can learn to rest in God and be quiet and be in perfect certainty. Because we can cope with the present moments, but we can't cope with something that's a mental image, right? We can't cope with the future because it's not real. It can only be here. So when we're starting to understand that our life situation is not our life, then we can see how we contaminate our psyche, the collective human psyche and our inner space, right? Because if we're not in joy or in, ease or lightness, then our present moment is being covered by time. So sometimes it's not changing what we're doing, it's changing how we're doing, the attitude that we have. Because if you're trying to give your full attention to something, you can't have any resistance. It's not possible. So very similar to how we have our relationships. If there's a resistance to your partner, that means you're not fully present. And that's why I have individuals always ask me, what if my partner doesn't want to raise his consciousness? Well, my solution to that is, as long as they're present, that's all that matters, because you guys are making at least the decision to be committed to one another. Because if you love each other, then it doesn't matter what the other person does. So you have to ask, am I at ease at this moment, or what's going on inside of this moment? Because you have to be able to monitor your inner state, and the more you do that, the more you're strengthening that power. You're sharpening that focus, if you want to call it that, because we're starting to understand that primary reality within and secondary reality without. So when you're starting to see people in their highest lights, you start to see the understanding of, okay, I am a reflection of everything in this world because this is my consciousness. So I wanted to look at the idea of the present moment as a movie, okay? So when we're looking at this from a perspective of a night dream, if you want to call it that, or a movie, like in Tufte by Vadim Zeland, it's only when you awaken that you say that it never was, and you see the perfection. So it's a process of awakening. It's a process of being more aware. It's a process of expanding your consciousness, right? Just like you experience life, you're like, oh, I didn't know that. So that's how you become an adult. You're maturing your consciousness. So you have to go through it, and it's something that can't be given. So from my experience, I can try to explain how I awakened in this life, but it's only until you experience it yourself that you actually understand what it means. Because I can try to explain it that it's like a lucid dream, and you can have a lucid dream and you're like, oh yeah, I woke up in this dream. But when you experience it in this world, you're like, wow, I really understand what that means. And you're cackling, and basically you start to see that momentary picture, right, it's a reflection of how you're supposed to live your entire life. The problem is that we trick ourselves back into the delusion. So the world is basically the self, right? There's nothing but God, and you're it, right? So it's a reflection of who you are. So there should be no contradiction in terms of the top state, just kind of like flow. So you have to be exactly what you are, and that's why we see the tremendous struggle, right, that we do, giving up joy, trying to gain it, right? And that's why we put time in there, because time is supposed to be something that is not real. Truth is something that is never changing. So that's why we are talking about the apocalypse, right? The end of times. We are looking at the Greek definition of the revelation, right? We're putting this understanding of who we are as time is being depleted. Not depleted, but disappearing, if that makes sense. Disappearing the illusions of what that is. So that's why when you have these ayahuasca trips or these peyotes or whatever it may be, not that I've ever done it before, but I've had similar experiences, you have these experiences that are like 80 years old, and you feel like you've gone through so many lifetimes, and it's because you're taking that moment and augmenting that. Okay, you're basically going deeper and deeper within yourself and seeing the eternity and the ever-present, omniscient, omnipotent thing that you actually are within yourself. So when we look at time, right, we basically are looking at our movie reel in different sections, right? We're looking at one frame at a time and saying that yesterday was one frame, tomorrow is another, and it is basically how we choose to look at the whole reel, right? We have to learn to see it, perceive it, and realize it to accept it, and that's when we start thinking deeper that we can see the ever-present nowness in truth, okay? Because when we are taking the consideration that joy is supposed to be all time within ourselves and no sorrow, because that's how we're connected to ourselves, then we have to understand why we must want this growth more than we want the world, more than we want the approval, right? And that's why we give these videos, to give you methods every day to learn something new, right? Because every moment is an opportunity to grow, right? The more we're doing that, the more we're letting go of ego. The more the ego is zero, the more God is all. As you see the world, so are you. So it's impossible to see something we know within ourselves. We don't know within ourselves, okay? If it bothers us, it's the very same thing that's within ourselves, right? You see someone within yourself, and basically, as you let that go, you let go of ego. So thou art that here and now. And something that I learned from this book, Breaking the Habit of Being Yourself, Joe Dispenza said, the subjective mind has an effect on the objective world. Consciousness directly controls the tiny world of atoms, and thoughts create reality. So the brain is organized to reflect everything that we know. So when we are looking at familiar memories, we basically are reminding ourselves. We are recontextualizing our mind and putting the limitation, because we're seeing things with the same level of mind. That's why we have the same problems. And basically, you're reminding yourself of who you think you are in the world, right? An identity defined by everything outside, observing the reality with the equal mind. So that's why we start to see that the brain doesn't change, because we're not actually seeing something that's different. The brain has a complete record of the past, firing circuits to reflect what you already know, thus the past being the future. So when we are now understanding that we take that in consideration of facing the ego every single time with our spouses, with our partners, with the world, then we can see that there's nothing but ourselves out there. Our eyes, our consciousness, and understanding is it grows rapidly, because we start to take in consideration that all these impositions that we have on others is basically what we were reflecting from ourselves. So it's very difficult to see anything outside of ourselves, because it's something that we don't want to see. That's why we have so many fights with our spouses and relationships, because we're not seeing that the faults that we see in them is the same faults that we see in ourselves. So very similar to how we see someone that wants to be number one, right? We don't like it, we resent them. We see that we also want to be the number one, right? So we have to look within ourselves, meditate, and then become quiet. And that's how we become certain of our answer, because it's supposed to always come, right? That's when you start to learn that knowing something works is different than believing something works, right? It's that 0.01% of doubt that makes the difference. So you must see this and let it go. And with the wish of letting go, it ceases to exist in the old way, and that's why it stops bothering you. So you must want imperturbability more than you want control, approval, and security, if that makes sense. Okay, and that's why it's very difficult for us when we deal with our parents or family, because we have the same similar characteristics, right? We have it and we see it, right? And we spot it, we got it. And even when we feel the lifts, right? You have this agreement, right? And just as you can feel this high with praise, you can be dropped down very quickly with the same thing as rejected. So we have an equanimity of not being dependent of our joy from others, right? It's not outside of ourselves. So this idea of being defined by everything outside of ourselves, we have to be greater than our environments, our body, and time, if that makes sense. Because a master, if you want to call it that, sees perfection in all. And basically what we're trying to do is get to a point that we're seeing beyond the falsity of this illusion, this Maya, okay? Because everyone is trying to return to the true self and let go of ego, right? We all make errors in a direction, and the further we go, the further we are. But we feel trouble, and we fail, and then we have no other choice but to look back. So think what you want. But sometimes we need to learn what the contrast is so we can actually appreciate and be grateful for the things such as love, happiness, and joy. So basically what we have done is create a limitation, and we have limited ourselves just enough to ask for help, right? And it's just a circle, right? This circle is just a capsule or some form of barrier. And these are our bodies, right? We've learned this a little bit. And the closest thing that we've gotten to limitation was the causal body, right? The world of ideation. And then the astral after that, which is dreams, where things are instantly created. And then we have the physical realm, right? This is the lowest states. And that's why when we die, right, it's a freeing, because it's only a momentary thing, but it's only after we die. So we fear the pain of dying more than we fear the pain of actually suffering. But nonetheless, we have to understand that the pain in this life is a lot greater than it is in dying, because it's a liberation rather than a continuous imposition of suffering within ourselves. So when we look at the ego is lowest in the physical realm, and we can only go lower within the physical realm. That's why we see individuals that intoxicate themselves and beat themselves up, and it's like they're not even there, right? We see that so often. So we have to see that the more that we eliminate the sense of the ego, the more we become more self-realized, right? When we are the all, we see that the opportunity is most possible within this realm than any other realm, because it's so difficult that the incentive is greatest, right? The more life gets easier, the less the incentive is to develop, right? Because we see that in this life, we are trying to figure out how we're going to eat, pay rent, get out of that. And it's basically trying to see how we can find happiness, right? We're trying to find the peace and truth and joy within ourselves. And once we start to see that the negative world is the thing that is pulling our consciousness, then we start to see why it's so important to be in the present moment. Because anything that we acknowledge, we're trying to support it, right? And then we have these mental thoughts that basically make it very difficult for us to make that possible, if that makes sense.